All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. My name is Nicola Walters, and I'm going to just offer some quick framing for the session. If this is your first time joining us for the Decolonizing Economics Summit, the third annual post-capitalism conference, we wanted to share with you a little bit about the intention behind the conference and help you to kind of get situated in the space that we're in here today. Others, I know, looking at some of our participants joining, have been with us for the last 3 days. So we're so grateful to have your participation and involvement here today. I am serving as the summit coordinator for this event, but this is really a culmination of an incredible group of people putting this together. Our summit is co-anchored by the Wiyot Tribe, Cooperation Humboldt, and faculty at Cal Poly Humboldt. I am specific in acknowledging faculty and departments are the entities of Cal Poly Humboldt that are supporting us. This is not something that is sponsored by Cal Poly Humboldt formally, and I think that that's important to note because there are people who are interested in having very critical discussions about how we're treating our earth, and that's not always in alignment with the way that our institutions are moving forward. And I want us to be thinking about that. I'm sure that our summit will speak more on that topic as well. But our decision to focus on decolonizing economics has resulted in some incredibly powerful presentations and panels over the last 3 days. This conference focuses on the way in which individuals and institutions can create the infrastructure and practices to address economic disparities, often requiring us to protect or restore the land and water, redistribute wealth towards marginalized communities, and invest in the solidarity economy. Through the summit, we hope to contribute to the growing network of transformative solutions that are building all around us, strengthen existing organizations, especially those doing solidarity economy work, and create a space for organizations to share best practices and collaborate across issues and constituencies toward collective liberation. We hope that this conference will provide us concrete next steps and allow us to co-create those along the way so that we can implement cooperative economic practices in our own community. As you can see from our conference name, we've been contributing to the post-capitalism conversation for 3 years now. But our focus to our lens really of decolonizing economics is a way for us to challenge the way that we move beyond capitalism and to think about how our relationships will look as we decolonize economics and build the future that we all deserve. So I'll pass it over to Gary Hughes to introduce this panel. And again, we thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you so much to everyone who is here with us. I am attempting now to quickly share a couple slides to offer an introduction to our panel, Carbon Supremacy, False Equivalencies, and Corporate Impunity, how dominant paradigms of climate policy reinforce colonialist structures and what you can do about it. I'm really honored to have a collection of presenters, high level talent, and really unique analysis. Dr. Doreen Stabinsky, Marta Dina Arguello, and Thomas Joseph are joining us, and myself, Gary Graham Hughes. I work with the organization Biofuel Watch. I'm the Americas Program Coordinator. We're an international organization. I manage a fair number of projects throughout Latin America. And what we're finding again and again is that this concept of net zero is creating tremendous challenges for the grassroots. And so our panel is going to look at a combination of international, national, California, and local North Coast dynamics around climate colonialism and how it's being manifested in the predominant discourses in climate policy. I want to share something really quick here in my little collection of slides just to get it started. I have been working on environmental issues for decades. And one of the flags I like to wave on the North Coast, as I grew up splitting time basically between Humboldt County and Eugene, Oregon. And I cut my teeth as a defender of the ancient forest back in the 1980s at the University of Oregon. And I was also very involved with Redwood Summer and other efforts to defend the ancient redwoods. And over the decades of being involved with the environmental movement, it's been really sobering to see how things have changed and how much the focus on markets-based and other types of mechanisms that basically reinforce business as usual have taken over the environmental discourse. For Biofuel Watch, a response to that has been to work really actively with different networks. One of our primary involvements is with the Global Forest Coalition, which is a network of more than 100 campesino, indigenous, and community-based organizations in 60 countries around the world. And I think this one graphic from Global Forest Coalition about how our nature is not your solution can really help capture a lot of what we're going to explore in this panel. And what we see essentially here is that the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change are also increasingly the communities that are most vulnerable to the policies that are being developed ostensibly to respond to climate change. And this is a really important frame for people to have for this panel. Some of the work that Biofuel Watch has done that we believe that is really relevant, and we hope participants in the panel can take some of this with them to follow up on later. We were a part of the effort to put together a report that came out last summer called The Big Con, really looking deeply at how the whole net zero climate agenda is one of incredible climate obfuscation. And Biofuel Watch also had and has and continues to have a key role in the Hoodwinked in the Hothouse collaborative. ClimateFalseSolutions.org, you can check out the third edition of Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. This is a really neat, excellent pop education a manner to learn about the issues that we'll be discussing in this panel. And then lastly, I do want to emphasize that one of the biggest matters that I'm working on that really seems to encapsulate this whole issue of climate colonialism dominating California climate policy is the fact that 2 of the 5 major refineries in the San Francisco Bay Area are right now being permitted to begin to process basically food for fuel. There's many kinds of feedstocks that are being thrown around as what will be used to make renewable diesel or a sustainable aviation fuel. But it's very clear that soy, for instance, is one of the primary commodities that will be used to make these fuels. These refineries are being rubber stamped into being biofuel refineries. May 3rd is a hearing before the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors as we appeal the certification of the final EIRs for both the Marathon Nestle joint venture at the Martinez refinery, as well as the Phillips 66 Rodeo refinery biofuels project. These projects are being rammed through, and it really exposes a crisis in climate governance here in the state. And the fact that California could be so excited about being able to make fuels in a high emissions refining process relying on high deforestation risk commodities and call it a climate solution really does expose a lot of the ethical and moral problems that we're facing in the state. So having just really quickly touched on some of the work that Biofuel Watch is doing and tried to rapidly just throw a net out there about our panel, I'm now going to go ahead and turn it straight over to our first panelist today, Doreen Stebensky, Dr. Doreen Stebensky, and I'm going to let Doreen introduce herself. And again, just want to thank the conference, the summit organizers for making all of this possible, and then for everyone who's tuned in today on a beautiful Saturday to join us. Thank you so much for being here.
Right, well, thank you, Gary, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm assuming my mic is okay, and you are seeing the first slide of my presentation. I'm so happy to be there in Arcata, even if it's virtually. I lived in Arcata many years ago. I studied at what was then called Humboldt State. many, many years ago. Right now, I'm speaking to you from the other side of Turtle Island, on the far northeast corner of Turtle Island, from the traditional homelands of two of the nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the traditional homelands of the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy. I am a professor at a college here called College of the Atlantic, a professor of global environmental politics. And my starting point, a starting point for today, I'm given the big picture. I'm looking internationally, and I'll start off by referencing a professor in Newfoundland, Max Liboiron, who says that pollution is colonialism. For Liboiron, colonialism is defined in relation to land, and so specifically settler access to indigenous land, which for them includes indigenous ideas and cosmologies and life. But in the case of climate change, I'd also argue, and I think many others argue, that this process of colonialism, the colonial reach, also extends to the atmosphere, and that the ongoing pollution of the atmosphere with carbon emissions is the colonizing of that commons. But I'd also sort of like to, I do that somewhat with some caution, because I also don't tend to use decolonization as a metaphor. I think that the decolonization, the land back movement is very much about land and struggles to return land. And so, which I think of as distinct from the work of stopping the colonization of the atmosphere. But that said, the work to stop climate change, the work to stop the colonization of the atmosphere with the pollution of fossil fuels, it's very much, it's certainly anti-colonial. And I'll do a bit in my talk today to lay out some arguments against carbon offsets and then their relation to ongoing carbon colonialism. Stopping climate change, stopping carbon colonialism requires nothing less than stopping putting emissions into the atmosphere. Nemo Bassi, this is a quote from Nemo Bassi of the Hands Off the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, says, keep the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. But that's not where climate policy is right now, which we know, and this is the case from the international to the local, and from Gary's pictures of the refineries in Contra Costa County. And the most common way that policymakers deal with pollution is by treating it as a waste management problem, not at the beginning of the generation of the waste, but as the treatment of the waste. You assume that the waste will happen, and we just have to find something to do with the waste. We have to put it in the right place. We have to provide carrots and sticks, not to make too much waste, but the waste, the pollution itself isn't questioned. And instead of stopping carbon pollution, the main policy answer that was set up by the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was to create a market in carbon. Developed country parties to the Kyoto Protocol, they set a cap for themselves. They set a mechanism to trade with each other underneath that cap, giving out rights to continue to pollute. In this diagram, those rights are allowances, and including mechanisms for offsetting emissions. And in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, those were called the Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation. Those initial cap and trade and offset schemes then set the stage for further development and application in other regulatory spaces. We have the European Union emissions trading system. We have California's cap and trade scheme. So to be clear, the market mechanisms that have been set up are means to actually avoid stopping pollution. It's not about stopping pollution. It's about managing it somewhat. And so, I think we can say that market mechanisms enable the continued colonial grabbing of the atmosphere. Carbon pollution is colonialism. It's grabbing that atmospheric space. So then it shouldn't be any surprise that the market mechanisms themselves operate in colonial ways. And today I want to focus on offsets. And so in brief, what are carbon offsets? I talk about carbon offsets as, you have one entity that is emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they pay another entity to do something that's considered useful to address climate change, which would not have been done otherwise. There's this requirement of additionality in the offset. For it to be an offset, it needs to be something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That could be reducing emissions elsewhere, so providing clean cook stoves to women in developing countries, or not cutting down old growth forests, so avoiding emissions, or planting trees or restoring natural ecosystems and actually increasing the carbon dioxide that you're pulling out of the atmosphere. They're all admirable things to do. Some benefit the climate more than others. But at base, the main point of an offset is that someone else keeps putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They keep polluting, right? And offsetting has become rather popular again of late, and it's spurred on by this net zero craze that Gary mentioned, whether it's net zero or carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, these greenwashing terms greenwashing, green cloaks that corporates are covering themselves in. And yeah, so offsets play an important role there. It's an interesting role that offsets play. Let me just say a little bit about this net zero that Gary had talked about. Net zero is set out in the Paris Agreement, and net zero is this idea that you can balance emissions with removals, that you emit and then you remove, and when everything's in balance, that's just fine. And you see this balance here is emissions on one side, and carbon sequestration or removals on the other side. And there's a necessary part of this greenwashing, of the pulling on the green cloak related to offsets, because there's a deliberate, I would say, and dangerous confounding of this idea of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and offsetting, right? Because remember, if you remember that list of offsets that I showed you, only one of these types of offsets is actually removals, right? The other types of offsets, and in fact, like 95% of offsets are the other kinds of offsets where you're actually not doing any balancing at all. You're having emissions going up and there's no emissions coming down, right? But corporations don't care about that. And that confounding has then enabled lots of corporate claims, including some new corporate claims of things like carbon neutral LNG, carbon neutral liquid natural gas, and net zero oil. So Total, 2019, recently, Total, the oil company Total, sent off a shipment of what it was calling carbon neutral LNG to China. And they said that the carbon, that the liquid natural gas was completely offset. It was carbon neutral because they purchased some 10-year-old carbon credits from a wind farm in China, right? So there's no balancing at all there. There is a lot of greenwashing there. Oh, I meant to show you this slide, just showing that it's pervasive. You find lots of slides like this on the internet where balancing it isn't actually balancing, right? Where you have emissions, but you don't necessarily have removals. In 2021, Occidental Petroleum sold what it claimed was carbon neutral LNG. The credits were generated between 2016 and 2019. So these are credits from years ago that are still sort of on the market because no one has bought them yet. It's really quite cheap. So it's really quite cheap to like buy a bunch of old wind or solar credits from developing countries and then claim that your shipment of liquid natural gas is miraculously carbon neutral. Occidental's got a latest claim for net zero oil. This is just shows the the impunity and the just that they don't actually really care about whether there's any sort of balancing out or not. The net zero oil, which they sold to a Korean firm in 2022, that net zero oil will be made net zero because there will be removals at the end of 2024 when a direct air capture facility called 1.5 comes online. Occidental is working with this direct air capture facility to help it actually make more oil, because what you do when you capture carbon dioxide from the direct air capture facility, you capture the carbon dioxide, you liquefy it, and you put it underground and you store it underground. It's usually most economical when you do it in the context of enhanced oil recovery, and this is exactly what Occidental Petroleum is doing. They're getting carbon credits for putting carbon dioxide underground that is helping them extract oil, additional oil, right? So the scams and the schemes just kind of multiply, but it's a very nice greenwashing, a very nice cloak that net zero provides, greenwashing cloak that net zero, nature-based solutions, carbon neutrality. And, all of the oil companies are doing their best. Here's Shell with talking about net zero energy emissions, and it's nature-based solutions, and it's all about trees. All of this together is the latest strategy to carry on with polluting. I mean, remember I said that offsets are about continuing to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's continuing that colonial grab of the atmosphere. Greening corporate images by claiming net zero and carbon neutrality and nature-based solutions while continuing to pollute. Because the point of the strategies is to enable the ongoing burning of fossil fuels. The point of the strategies is to unstrand stranded assets, that those fossil fuels that those corporates own and still want to be able to burn, right? It's a strategy of continuing to burn. What does that look like in the global marketplace? Who are some of the players? In 2020, the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets was created. Because if you look at the size of the stranded assets, if you look at the amount of oil and gas and coal that the corporates want to continue to burn, you realize that if you're going to use offsets in order to, as the sort of smoke screen to continue to burn that oil and gas, you need a lot of offsets. So the whole point here is to scale the voluntary carbon markets. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, former governor of the Bank of Canada. This isn't small. This isn't a small enterprise. This was Mark Carney, largest banks around the world, largest investment institutions around the world, all of whom have significant assets tied up in fossil fuels, along with the fossil fuel majors, the airlines, the shipping. They were all together trying to figure out, how do you scale the voluntary carbon market? How do we come up with more and more carbon credits to help them greenwash their continued fossil emissions? And doing it in a way, and it's been a rather Wild West market. They're trying to do it in a concerted way to scale. This is scaling not just for spot market transactions. It's scaling not just for this year, I need to buy some offsets for the oil that I'm going to ship this year. This is about creating, securitizing, derivatizing, creating futures markets. The bulk of these offsets that they're trying to generate. They're very intentionally talking about how do we create these as securities? How do we create these as futures options? The idea is to make as tangible a credit as possible, in order to then, package. And 10 years ago, actually, I think this report came out 10 or 11 years ago, we were warned about, 10 years ago, of subprime carbon, of, creating these derivativized, securitized packages that could lead to a subprime crash, lead to a crash similar to what we saw with the subprime market. Let me see. I think I'm close to done. This might be my next to last slide, just to give you a view of the order of magnitude that we're talking about. To stay below 1.5, we have a very small remaining carbon budget. And sorry for the the spelling error here. I got this off of the internet, so don't blame me, but still apologize for it nonetheless. 565 billion gigatons of carbon dioxide is what we can continue to emit and still stay below 1.5. I mean, the lesson, the message is that we have to keep oil in the soil and coal in the hole. That larger red bubble is the assets that the fossil industry and their investors and their bankers, et cetera, want to try and unstrand and want to try and put into our atmosphere. So, just some final thoughts: that offsets colonize the atmosphere for the profits of global capital and the maintenance of a fossil-based economy. The underlying assumption of an offset market is that carbon pollution can continue. It is colonialism and it threatens us all. And yeah, we need to keep the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. So thank you very much. And I think I am supposed to pass it right along to Marta. So very much looking forward to the rest of the presentations and the conversation afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. So my presentation really does begin and is framed by the context that Doreen gave around colonialism and what happens when we continue with an extractive economy. And I've been involved, I'm the executive director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. I've been involved in California's climate policy for a long time, and I've served on the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, where I've watched the train of, and that's why my presentation is California Captured. And what I often say is that we are captured by the myth of carbon and the primacy of carbon as the driving force for how we should do our climate policy. And from a public health perspective, yes, it is important to address carbon, but we should see it as a co-pollutant, because no facility just emits carbon. And if we myopically focused, as California has done, on carbon, well, then you end up having quite a few problems. And so we often, in my dark humors, is what is the next storm that is coming our way in terms of climate policy? Well, much like Doreen said, we've got AB 32, which is essentially a trading program. We try to negotiate, may include trading versus shall include trading, and it got changed to may, but immediately the governor issued an executive order that basically directed the California Air Resources Board to only consider a trading program. And so we have been fighting that cap and trade program since 2006, before it was passed. And then after it was passed, we continued to fight, and we're one of the groups of many who sued to try to stop the carbon trading program, because we thought there was a better way that focused on reducing air pollution, that actually said, thou shalt not pollute. We will keep oil in the ground, although, 10 or however many years ago, 2006, we were not talking about keep oil in the ground, because but we knew that that's what we needed to do. We needed to shift away from the refineries And had we acted then, where would we be now? Had we acted then with the concept of keep fossil fuels in the ground, stop combustion, shift the economy quickly, we might be in a better place in terms of the health of our communities, but also the looming threat of climate change, which is now seen as an emergency. And since it's an emergency, let's just do everything. And if you've got a lot of money and you want to commodify carbon, there's a lot of solutions that end up looking like great ideas, but it ignores who pays. It ignores a number of things. One is that it is firmly rooted in what Doreen was talking about, which we call the extractive economy. It's a worldview around consumerism, a colonial mindset, that things are there for their exploitation, that the human rights of the people who live on that land don't matter, because the greater good is to amass wealth. It is extraction, it is dig, burn, and dump. It is, again, militarism, and we see that now in a very palpable and visceral way with the war in Ukraine and the role of oil. And then the purpose is to enclose wealth and power, to concentrate wealth and to concentrate power. And we see that as well, right? The role of the environmental justice community has been really to stop the bad, right? Think of the fights over incinerators, the fights over drilling, all of those have been to stop the bad. And in that fight to stop the bad, we have come to understand the need to have a visionary and oppositional view of how we're going to build the new. What should that look like? And if you commodify carbon, your view of what the new is myopic and continues to keep the burdens of the fossil fuel economy on the backs of the frontline communities. And of course, then the global impacts. And so what we're trying to do at many different places, and it's hard when you're working within institutions who move at the rate of glacial speed before climate change, is really change the rules, right? We want to draw down money and power by changing the rules and engaging in institutions, and that's really frustrating. But it's also building community power to fight for real solutions and to fight to create our ability to see solutions beyond things that are commodifying carbon. And so we want to get to a living economy that we are an economy case based on caring and sacredness. So, universal health care, universal school, universal access to higher education, or trade school, whatever that is, right? What would our economy look like if that's the products we wanted to make, instead of fueling our consumerism and a culture that makes us feel empty unless we're buying, which I'm often guilty of doing myself. And then, and the other part of that is deep democracy, engaging with communities, having us at the table, co-designing the solutions, right? And we talk about policy design at CARB as we're fighting to have a scoping plan that actually embodies some of these values, is that we want to be involved from inception to evaluation of programs so that they embody the kinds of transformations that we need. And, we're seeing that in the building decarbonization efforts, that yes, we want to decarbonize buildings. Yes, we want to stop using natural gas in our homes because it's a health impact. And as we do it, we have to be mindful of housing insecurity, of energy insecurity, and how do we roll out a program that massively electrifies our homes with appliances, with heat pumps, with induction stoves, and make sure that we don't further embed the negative impacts of the fossil fuel economy onto poor people who may not be able to adopt those new technologies early on, right? So those are all things that we are holding sacred as we fight to push back around the false solutions that are fueled by net zero thinking and technological solutions that actually extend the life of fossil fuels. So this is from Hoodwinked in the Hut House, and it's really about these are some of the challenges, right? market-based myopia, we want everything to be large, industrial scale, corporate technical fixes. What we need is to move away from large centralized power, localized clean power production, where you're not relying on transmission lines and other things that can go haywire, right? So, and to bring the direct air quality benefits and the health benefits to communities who have been overburdened by that large scale industrial production that we are so enamored of with, right? And then, you know, again, this deep democracy, how do you create opportunities for communities to decide, right? How do we move away from a decide, announce, and defend model of decision-making where the regulators working with the regulated industry collude, they decide this is what's going to work out, because at the end of the day, AB 32 was not designed to lower emissions. It was designed to supposedly lower the cost of compliance for these companies, right? So again, it is designed for them to continue their practices and somehow play around at the margins. And so we're trying to move to this new, you know, how do we move ourselves, the culture, and our government systems away from this market-based myopia that the market is magic, and more to having an ecological grounding and consciousness about how we actually restore the planet and ourselves, given the damage that colonialism, systematic racism have done to our communities and our own psyches. So I'm going to shift a little, and this is a slide from the California Air Resources Board. This is their plan to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century, 2045. They're going, you know, these are the sources, but they are relying on carbon capture, direct air capture, and natural and working lands, which involve a lot of forest offsets to get to carbon neutrality and even net negative. Right? So net negative is not real negative. It's not net zero. But when you frame things as we can get to net zero, then you actually don't have to, you know, face the hard choices. These are not going to be easy, right? To shift our economy so radically away from fossil fuels at the rate that we need is a little daunting, but we've got to figure it out. And at the same time, instead of, you know, this attitude of burn now, pay later, and how do we actually begin to center the policies that we're doing on the most impacted? This is a map from CalEnviroscreen. You can Google CalEnviroscreen, and it's about 21 measures of economic and environmental and health vulnerability. The darker the areas, the more polluted they are. So you see that the spine of California through the Central Valley and down into, you know, the Los Angeles area, which is the port area, and down into the border areas. And I think that's Hunters Bay View Point, the little red, I'm not sure what the red point on the coast is. My geography is bad, but you can see this is where the burdens currently exist. The way net zero is, and the cap and trade program, and many of the programs that are rolling out of the state of California, particularly this obsession with carbon capture and sequestration, because, you know, there's money, means that the project, remember this previous slide that showed you where the highest rates of pollution are. These dots are where there's potential for carbon capture. It's the same communities. It is the spine of California. It exists where communities right now are living with refineries, oil extraction, pipeline, and storage. And so it tells you that this is basically a plan to continue to burn fossil fuels, call them something else, pretend that hydrogen is the solution here, and tell us that that we're going to sequester this carbon, that we're not going to have to change our behavior, that we're going to find also questionable solutions to deal with cement and others that are hard to decarbonize, right? So if you only focus on carbon, then these seem okay, right? But some of the carbon capture and sequestration technology will suck up the carbon but leave the other pollutants. So that to me is, you know, the definition of evil, right? Because the workers and the communities that live there are going to breathe that pollution, and in some cases it actually concentrates some of the pollutants. And so we have no idea what the worker and community health impacts are of taking out carbon, but leaving other pollutants, right? When you only focus on carbon, you forget these, and you're denying those communities in the spine of California the right to breathe clean air for at least another 100 years if you're extending the life of that fossil fuel industry. And so other solutions, ethanol, which is part of the low carbon fuel standards. There's plans already, and this is one community victory won by the folks in the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, the Central Valley Asthma Coalition, Center for Race, Poverty, Environment, and others. This was already a facility that had been shut down, and they were already in the permitting process to make it where it would burn ag waste and biomass while capturing CO2. That CO2 would be injected underground, and that permit was pulled recently. And so, this is an important point here, is that there's already efforts on the ground to permit facilities throughout the Central Valley. There's projects in the Delta. And I think it's important to inform communities right now with science-based information, and to remind all of us that in the push for carbon capture and sequestration, we are only hearing the good data, right? That it can capture this much, but in reality, it may not. And in reality on the ground, some of these facilities are not capturing the amount of carbon that they promised, and sometimes emitting more. And if you did a life cycle assessment from the construction to its retirement, I don't know that these are economically feasible, nor will they get us to real zero reductions in safer communities. And as we heard, stop an extractive model of economic development and the myth of constant growth, which fuels many of these projects. So there's plans for CCS on refineries. I think this is where even, this is a big fight, because we don't want to do more enhanced oil recovery. We don't want to extend the life of the refineries in California if we're going to address climate change. It's the new kind of climate denialism, right? That you could address climate by not stopping the very practice that got us here, burning fossil fuels. And then there's also these myths that somehow we're going to get it right, that we can regulate it. But ask anyone who lives frontline and fence line to a facility. We have a horrible regulatory system that continues to treat communities like sacrifice zones, that is in collusion and tightly, through employment, through friends and relationships and professional relationships. The industry that's being regulated is very much tied to the regulatory agencies, and they are captured. So they are not going to do the kind of oversight. This takes forever. You have to, really monitor this for a long time. We don't do well. Most storage leaks. And so we've really got to just say no to these kinds of policies and hold firm, even in the face of, but it's an emergency, right? Yes, and it's an emergency. And you know what we need to do? We need to shore up the communities that live fence line, who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. We have waited too long. We should really focus on building the capacity of communities to bounce back and be resilient, even though our community, I hate the word, but I get stuck using it because of the climate word. We are very resilient people. If you think what's been done to communities of color, indigenous communities, and Black communities, we are incredibly resilient. What we now need is infrastructure and other that is non-racist and allows us to survive through the coming crises. I just really, maybe I'm in my dark and gloomy mode, but I do think we've waited too long, and that the focus and money that's being spent on carbon capture needs to be spent on a restorative economy that allows us the ability to thrive in the face of all this. And so what we're doing now is really organizing against the onslaught of these false solutions. And, you know, we often feel like we are literally standing in front of a moving train that is committed to the opposite of doing the right thing. And then I want to talk a little bit about who's supporting CCUS, because we like big and big jobs, big projects, right? That is incredibly attractive to big labor. And so you've got some building trades and others who support CCUS and CCS projects. And it is, partly a failure within the environmental movement to actually build the kinds of alliances over the last 20 years that we needed for a just transition, because we were stuck in this, well, just be a solar installer or just do this, right? And that jobs versus the economy versus the environment dialogue that is permeated environmental policy is led to this, right? Where communities and workers who should be united are not. But we also know, this is a really busy slide, and I'm gonna, sorry, I was gonna try to open it up because it's really fascinating. So if I can only learn to manage my PowerPoint there. This, I'm not sure why it's moving, but that map was basically a map of the influencers who are, I don't know what happened, sorry. It's a map of the influencers and who are involved in funding and advocating for carbon capture and sequestration. So you've got from, so you've got Bill Gates, you've got Chevron, you've got Bezos Earth Fund, you've got Lawrence Livermore Labs, you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mary Nichols, and you see sort of the combination of forces of these neoliberal policies who at one point say we've got to be aggressive on climate change, and another give us a solution that allows the fossil fuel industry to continue to pollute. And this is at the site Little Sis, you could see it. It also shows the revolving door of folks who have been at the agency and are now advocating for carbon capture, that talks, which allows us to see just how it's how those relationships and friendships allow these policies to continue and for there to be a revolving door. I'm afraid to touch anything now. All right, so I wanted to go back to this slide because I wanted to sort of bring us back into, like, what does it mean for us to do these alternative policies? Where can we, at what scale can we do them, given that we've got, government forces that are actively promoting this? So it goes back to really organizing and mobilizing communities on the ground. And the work that we've done around stopping oil drilling in Los Angeles, the work that Stand LA has done, the work that Vision is doing is, one, keeping fossil fuels in the ground. The California Environmental Justice Alliance is working at the scoping plan to try to get the best scoping plan we can and move things. And then we as communities are trying to educate board members. We're trying to educate policymakers who have bought into the myth. So when you have delegations of California legislators going to Glasgow and you watch their tweets and saying, "Oh, carbon capture," and when you see them saying, "But there's money in Justice 40 and money's coming from the Biden administration, we need to do this," without having a depth of knowledge, right? So the environmental justice community has been building our depth of knowledge on the technology, on the impacts. And what we're finding is that folks haven't looked at the negatives, and that absence of data of harm does not mean something is safe. And that's, it's a hard sentence to say a number of times, but that is really what's happening here. As we look at efforts to push carbon capture, they are not looking at the potential health impacts of leaks, of ruptures, of what it means for all that trucking to happen. What does it do to communities when you are extending the life of a dangerous facility or shutting or reopening facilities? And then for us who are stuck in this idea that it's an emergency and we need to just try and do everything, we have been working with a group of folks who help us make some of those choices. And I'm going to walk you through the decision tree. And it's not always easy, right? But going back to natural practices and nature and learning from how we've done things in the past before we had this industrial, I think it's an important part of that, of how we imagine these things. So does nature have a solution for the problem? If it does, you know what you should do? Choose that solution. But let's not add carbon offsets to that, because there's not enough forest to offset what we're putting in. And then, are you trying to fix a problem another technology caused? Well, stop that technology that caused the problem. And then, are there many kinds of technologies which would solve the problem? Yes. If there is, well, let's ask these series of questions. Which technology is the simplest, can be easily repaired, lends itself to decentralization? Which technology requires the least amount of new materials mined from the earth? Which technology is readily reversible in case it causes problems? Nuke power comes to mind, right? More CCS comes to mind, right? What would have happened if we would have done this kind of decision-making around some of those technologies? Which technology adds to the commons, right? Which one actually acknowledges that we have to hold the commons sacred and protect them, and we cannot commodify them. You cannot buy and trade the sky. So technologies that allow you to do that, like carbon capture, low carbon fuel standard, again, do not meet this ecological standard. Which technology reduces inequality? I don't think any of these do. They deepen it. Which technology requires the least regulation or monitoring after it's deployed? I love this one. I worked for years on eliminating perchloroethylene from garment cleaning. And we came up with a technology that didn't require regulation because it was water-based, and we still lost, right? They chose, instead of, by banning perchloroethylene, they left the market open for two technologies. One was water-based, the other was a hydrofluorocarbon. That one has taken over the market because they had more money to market it. And the safest technology is the cleanest one, the one actually developed by a Korean dry clean owner because he was so concerned with chloroethylene, is getting pushed off the market, right? So if we had gone with this rule, we would actually have really safe garment cleaning. And why that matters is that both of those, one was, we've had tons of water contamination because of this. So which technology impacts other species the least? Which technology brings the most long-term benefits to future generations? Right? Imagine an economy that was based on protecting future generations versus one that just says, you're on your own, right? Which technology enhances community? Which technology has residuals that are most likely to be compatible with natural systems? And then if you don't have them, have we looked, right? What are the opportunity costs of chasing these tech solutions, right? I call it sort of it's military thinking, right? The engineers will fix the problem. This is a moral, social, ecological problem, and engineers shouldn't be in charge. Love engineers, but they shouldn't be in charge of that. It's the healers and the community organizers and the impacted communities that should be at the forefront, right? Of leading that. And then my favorite question is which technology is most beautiful? Because when you commodify everything, we lose the sense of beauty and wonder about just nature and the very simple things like justice. So what we're doing, and I'm really glad to be here, is that we're really growing the resistance to false solutions, to net zero thinking, and growing the voice for what it will take to create a restorative economy. This is a letter that we sent. There's a whole, I cut those out because I didn't think I had enough time, but there's a number of bills that are moving through the legislature, mostly bad. If you want more information, you can reach out to me. AB 1395 is one that we're currently negotiating with, but there is at least 7 other bills that are promoting carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture, including some bills around cement. And there's also some bills around setting goals for natural carbon sequestration. And we're watching all of those as they evolve in California. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Martha, I think we'll step on now to Thomas Joseph.
Mhm.
Can you hear me fine? My computer says I'm getting some connection errors, so hopefully it's coming through. Thumbs up, anybody?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, appreciate that. And sorry about that technical difficulties. Thank you, Gary, for inviting me to this panel, Decolonizing Climate Policy. And thank you so much to Doreen and Martha for really doing an excellent job and kind of making me rethink what I was going to share today, because there's just beautiful information shared, and I appreciate it, you know, and I thank you for being here, and it's an honor to be on this panel with you. My name is Thomas Joseph. I'm joining this panel from the ancestral lands of the unceded territories of the Hoopa people. I am a Hoopa tribal member, and I'm just right over the mountain from Cal Poly Humboldt, and so. I want to start with a quote to kind of give a little foundation on what decolonizing means to us as Indigenous people. Not that I'm speaking for all Indigenous people, but you know, Chief Seattle, he said this when he was having discussions with his matriarchs and fellow brethren, and he says, "For we know that if we do not sell, the white man may come with guns and take our land. How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them from us?" And literally, as we talk about climate change and carbon sequestration and carbon markets, this is what is being told to many Indigenous peoples across the globe. And as we try to encompass what does it mean to have tenure over 80% of the world's biodiversities, you know, some people may think that that's an honor, but it's actually heartbreaking to realize that Indigenous peoples own a small tenure of our Mother Earth, own in the aspect of the colonial consent, you know, and yet they are responsible for 80% of the world's biodiversities, because colonization has destroyed all of those biodiversities elsewhere. And when we look at carbon markets and carbon offsets, using traditional tribal lands for carbon sinks and sacrifice zones, we see it as a land grab. We see it as a manifestation of manifest destiny. But instead of being okayed by the Pope, it's being okayed by popular opinion that net zero is the way to go. And that if we have to sacrifice Indigenous lands for the well-being of all people, then let's do it. Just like manifest destiny and the sacrificing and the killing of my ancestors, that a nation may be born. But a nation that's deeply rooted in tactics and methods that destroys our Mother Earth, such as capitalism, such as a hunger for greed and self-gratification, leaving the concepts of our traditional ecological knowledge behind that has really been able to sustain these lands that we all now call home for thousands of years. You know, the traditional ecological knowledge that is heavily, you know, when we think about this knowledge-based system, it outdates any university structure on the globe. You know, it has been passed down for thousands of years. That this knowledge isn't because we think it's a good idea. It's heavily based on original scientists, Indigenous scientists, and so it's important that we create space for this knowledge to come forth, but create it in a way that it's not going to commodify it. And when we speak, when non-native people come to us and like, I was on a board a couple of days ago with CARB, and they were talking about creating space for traditional ecological knowledge. How can we do that in a manner that's not going to commodify it and think that we have right to it? Do we have right to it as citizens because it's what's in the best interest of our Mother Earth? How can we do that in a reciprocal manner? I'm sorry, I'm skipping around here on my notes, but I'm one of 10 children. And I have seen the influential power firsthand of the fossil fuel industry when I was at Standing Rock, and we know that power is never given, and that these corporations, this fossil fuel industry, has led us into many wars. Iraq. You can see that this issue currently in Ukraine that's going on. But to see that the military force firsthand lets you know that we're facing something a little bit, I would say, evil when it comes to the desire to destroy our Mother Earth, and that is what's going on, and that these fossil fuels companies have heavily embedded themselves in our governance, and that it's going to really take all of us coming together to be able to push for a new direction, kind of what Martha was talking about, a direction that also creates space for livable wages and healthcare for all. It's all tied in together, and so when we think of how colonialism has affected not our globe, but even here in our northern part of this now state of California, we look at dams, we look at water diversions and the genocide of indigenous peoples and their displacement, and how here in Hoopa we have many weeks of heavily inundated smoke from raging wildfires, and that these raging wildfires are caused because when California first, before it even came a state, it criminalized indigenous youth for starting fires. And it made it a law that if you see any indigenous youth starting a fire, that you can enslave them. And so the very first law of California was to criminalize brown bodies. And it has, now we're all paying the price for that. As we've not been able to use our traditional ecological knowledge for fire management and land practices, it gets pretty scary towards the end of especially towards the end of the summer. And so we also can see how we have to be able to make sure that we as we're moving forward to decolonize is that we change our mindsets of our practices, which includes capitalism. Like I don't know who's all familiar with when the windmills were being introduced to Humboldt County to help meet California's net zero, that electricity was going to be outsourced, and it was going to be these windmills were going to be placed on ancestral lands of the Wiyot people on their traditional sites, and then the electricity wasn't going to be used locally. So how can we rethink that about using our electricity locally? And that the importance of land back. And when we think of land back for indigenous peoples, we don't think about it in the, like Chief Seattle was saying, we don't think that we own the land. What we're saying is that we have the necessary skills and traditional ecological knowledge to manage these lands in a traditional manner that would best benefit all of us, including all of the biodiversities in our regions, and not just humans. I got some banging around out there. And when we talk about honoring our treaties, a lot of people here in California don't think that we have treaties, but treaties are basically an agreement between nations. And a lot of those agreements have been made with tribal nations in California and the federal and state government pertaining to water reclamation and even dam removal. And that we need to make sure that we continue to abide by these agreements and make sure that the tribal nations are being able to be at the decision-making table. And as we continue to address climate change, we need to also, when we think about colonialism and we're using these same techniques and these same practices that has caused colonialism to address climate change, it's just going to reoccur. And so you look at Thacker Pass in northern Nevada, that's tribal lands of the Shoshone Paiute there on the Oregon-Nevada border. And that lithium mine is being shoved down their throat for the sole purpose of electrical cars. And so how can we rethink that as well? And that by not addressing the root causes, that we're going to continue to experience using indigenous lands as sacrifice zones, whether it be mining or carbon sinks. When you think about these carbon sinks, these agreements can be seen as an additional act of colonizations, except that these agreements aren't being made with government to government. These agreements are being made with by tribal governments and corporations. And so it's the corporate elite that are now colonizing these tribal lands and gaining access through them through 100-year agreements. And so, we need to make sure that the tribes are well aware of those types of things. I see we're kind of getting close to time here, and I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions and answers. So I'm going to hand it back to Gary.
Well, thank you, Thomas, and all of our panelists. It's been such an interesting journey. I'm really appreciative of your participation. I might be looking to a little bit of assistance from Stephen, perhaps, if we're managing any questions. We've had several questions in the chat. It's one of the best places to add questions. Mark, with Sustainable Energy Inc. has offered a couple of questions. I'll go to your most recent question then. Mark, you made a point to Thomas about developing non-lithium batteries. Perhaps, though, we could also make sure to draw attention to the fact that I put the link in the chat to the Protect Thacker Pass website, the campaign there. Thomas, do you have anything that you want to add really quickly about what's going on with Thacker Pass or some of these concerns about, the environmental and human rights impacts from lithium mining?
So Thacker Pass they actually currently have a run that's going on from Nevada to Washington, D.C. to help bring awareness to this, but it's a lithium mine that's being proposed by a Canadian corporation to drill for lithium. I was out there last spring, and you can really feel the importance of that land as it's high up on the mountain pass there, and it's there's at the headwaters. But again, it's that mindset that for the greater good, we're going to have to sacrifice tribal lands for the benefit of everybody, because we need these electric cars to be able to reduce emissions. And and so it's just not the way to go. Like there's a lot more alternatives out there. I'm not sure the alternative that Mark is talking about, which is 3 to 7 times more, can hold more storage. I know there's other means, there's other means, and we don't need to continue to force tribal nations or indigenous peoples to remove them or destroy their land for the sole benefit of electric cars. You look at the infrastructure packages that are being introduced to the state of California for carbon capture and for carbon storage, and we can really build some amazing infrastructure that would really reduce emissions if we were to change the direction of implementation of these policies. I think Mark has his hand up.
Yeah, I'm deferring though to summit organizers in terms of the dynamics with managing questions, and that
So you could put them in the chat, Mark, and we'll call them out in the chat. That's where we're
Yeah.
working on it.
And
So thank you. Yeah, we have been developing the battery for about 10 years, and the solar, did the original multi-junction thin film solar back in 1982. Patent was filed and granted. And we're now pivoting to do the solar first because we need more resources to get the battery finished. We need resources for both. But basically, we're looking at being able to harvest twice as much electricity from the solar as from today's solar. And instead of creating silicon crystals and slicing them and sawing them and all that, we're just going to take ceramic minerals, ceramic oxides in a special mix and print them and then fire them. And that will be a solar collector that's 44% efficient once we're into volume production.
All right, Mark.
It'll cost very little too.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the contribution to the discussion. Again, I'd like to turn our attention to the excuse me, I'm having some problem with the mute. If there are others who have some comments, Jennifer, for instance, has brought up a comment about the land back movement. And Thomas, you had quickly brought some attention as well. Can you speak a little bit more about how things are evolving around land back as, in particular, a response to some of the climate colonialism that we've been seeing? Do you have any examples perhaps to share that you think merit more attention?
There's been organizations in the Bay and other parts of the United States that have purchased land and have given it back. We have seen here locally a name change of Patrick's Point to Sumeg. I would have liked to see that go even further and give direct management of that park back to the Yurok tribe, as they've managed those lands since time immemorial. And that would be that'd be an awesome example of land back. But when we think of land back, maybe not in this circle, but other circles, we get some people that show their fear, knowing the brutal acts of colonization in the past, and they think, well, if we give land back, then we're going to have to remove non-native folks or non-indigenous folks. We don't see it that way. So we can physically give land back with title and deed, but we can also give management back, which is a way that I would like to focus on it. There's a lot of state and federal lands here in our region that should be co-managed by tribal nations. Tribal nations should have a say on their ancestral territories on how to manage these public lands for the benefit of everybody. And not only will it empower and benefit local indigenous people, it'll benefit all citizens of California, all citizens of the United States. And also using those lands to managing those lands in a better way would help also address climate change. So it's a win-win for everybody. But not saying that, title and deed, that's awesome too. And so there's various different ways that we can look at land back. But I think a very important piece of that is the rematriation of land, understanding that it is our mothers, our aunties, our grandmas, our nieces that have a deep connection to place, and that a rematriation of land is a method to also address the extreme patriarchy that's heavily embedded in this climate chaos, this climate change policy work. And so that's hand in hand.
All right. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, thank you so much. And then we haven't gotten a lot of questions in the chat, though I do encourage folks to check out the chat for some really good insights. Oh, Thomas, we actually have a question for you. How do you have any ideas about how to conserve energy and carbon without cutting human activity? I think this is, for me, immediately one of those dynamics, though, where I think people have to really embrace the fact that we're headed on a pretty serious energy diet if we're going to address this equitably. But perhaps Thomas, maybe you have a comment, or I also want to make sure that Martha and Doreen could pitch something in after Thomas to keep the conversation going.
Excellent. Yes. You know, as climate chaos continues to unfold, we are going to be forced to change our day-to-day practices. Now, we can start making those steps in the now to help reduce emissions, or it's going to be forced upon us because Mother Earth's going to stand up and start fighting back, which we've already started to experience. And so we have to think about how can we navigate these spaces differently, maybe even less. We've seen how Zoom has been very beneficial without having all of us come to Humboldt County. That's a way to also reduce emissions. Public transportation is another way. But as long as that we have the fossil fuel industry heavily embedded, like you look at COP26 with the picture behind me, there is more representation there and inside the COP meetings from the fossil fuel industry than all of the representation out of the Amazon area. It was like 2 to 3 times as much as the United States delegation. And so as long as those people are directing the climate policy, we'll continue to see very little when it comes to transportation. Martha?
Yeah, I heard there was a man who had worked within the healthcare industry on the insurance side. And it was when he was the PR guy. And when they made a decision not to extend care for a young woman who died, he left the industry, and he wrote a book, and I'm not going to remember the book, but I remember the line: we have to disintermediate the insurance companies from healthcare. And I've heard some international advocates talking about what do we do to disintermediate the fossil fuel industry from these processes, right? Because they're at the table directing in this major imbalance of power. So I think more that we can do for that, I think it's really critical. And change the debate that they have to be at the table.
And perhaps Doreen, if you have some last words or some comments on these last questions. I think, we've had a tremendous session here, great panelists and really attentive participants, but I do think we're getting closer to wrapping it up.
Yeah, I would just add to Martha's comment about the disintermediation, because what's clear from the story that I had laid out, yeah, it's fossil fuel companies, but equally intertwined and problematic are the banks, are the investors, the ones who own the potentially stranded assets of stranded fossil assets. So yeah, I would add that. I also, going back to some of Martha's slides and thinking about the way that the question was framed about, cutting human activity. We don't have to cut human activity. We have to cut the use of fossil fuels providing energy for us. But, there's so much human activity that's possible without, relying on fossil fuels, the work in our communities, the work of feeding people, the care economy. Those are things that don't rely on fossil energy and are so critical to building a different world, right? So I think that the day-to-day work that we have to do is sort of thinking about how do we, for me, I look outside and, I'm spending more time in the garden, and pushed out there by COVID. But I mean, these are the kinds of transformations that I think are critical. And, the work that we do to connect with each other, to build community, to take care of each other, that to me is the critical work. That's human activity. We should be nourishing and increasing as much as we can. Yeah, there's some great, permaculture, biointensive gardening, rewilding the earth. So much work to be done. Without burning fossil fuels.
Right, exactly. There's so much good human activity still to be pursuing. I think this is my chance really to once again offer a tremendous thanks to the summit organizers. From concept to our arrival here today, Everything has been very satisfying, really exciting. The logistics of participating in the webinar have been really easy too. So thank you so much to the organizers. And then I do want to thank Dr. Silvaggio, Tony, for inviting me to contribute to this amazing summit. And then, of course, thank you so much to Thomas, Joseph, Marta, Dina Arguello, and Doreen Stavinsky for responding to my call, for bringing this incredible panel together. I've learned so much. I really appreciate it. And I think we are really pretty much there at the end. Thank you so much. And I would leave any very last comments to the summit organizers as they prepare people, because there's still some more activities this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Gary. This has just been such a tremendous panel, and we appreciate your all's contributions so much for helping us educationally and also just creatively thinking about the work that we're connected to on so many different levels. It's actually a really great transition point for our next panel as well, which is coming up between 3 and 4:30. The panel itself is specifically looking at labor and organizing in higher education. So y'all were talking a lot about labor organizing and how that is connected specifically to environmentalism, being part of the California Faculty Association, as are my colleagues here helping with this summit. We recognize that that's really where we need to be thinking about using organized labor to be pushing environmental agendas as well. So not going to be spoiling a lot of the great things that are going to be coming up as our colleagues from CFA, as well as Joe Barry and Helena Worthen, are picking up the conversation about power, precarity, and what we can really be doing to decolonize and transform education and the world around us. So thank you all again for this incredibly uplifting panel. Thank you all for participating in the summit, and we'll see you for the next session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Be
Thanks.
safe out there, everybody. Thank you.